Perfect. Okay, welcome everybody to the Simcoe County Museum's Black History Month virtual lecture series. My name is Meredith Patterson, and I am going to present our speaker of the day. So, our speaker of the day is Deirdre McCorkindale, and Deirdre McCorkindale is a historian interested in the history of race in North America with a focus on the African Canadian and African American experience. She has appeared in several documentaries talking about the Black history of Ontario, specifically the Chatham Kent region, and is a proud member and consultant for the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society. Okay, so Deirdre, I'm going to pass it on over to you.
Okay, so let me just share my screen so you have something to look at besides me. There we go. Okay, so rather than talking about, usually this month I am asked to talk about the Chatham Kent region, and I've done that a few times this month, but I think I decided for at least a few of my talks, what was badly needed is a discussion of why Black History Month is in February and the history of Black History Month in the first place. So I decided to do that for you guys today. So February and the weeks leading up to it are often very frustrating for Black historians, those of us who are at the local levels and those of us who are up in higher education. And I happen to be both because I wear a local historian hat with my local historical society and I work at the University of Guelph. And every year, we and quite frankly, the public get bombarded with questions of why we need Black History Month and the ethical implications of having it from multiple viewpoints. The discourse around this month comes every year, and there is multiple views. For many Black people, the month can be a very painful reminder of the lack of attention and resources paid to their past, present, and futures, or an exploitative time when they're asked to explain themselves to a wider public. Some Black folks see the cheapening and commercialization of their history in February because it's a chance for companies to use Harriet Tubman to sell you something. Some folks say that you can't relegate the history of Black people to a month, that our history is the story of North America, which is true, and part of the reason that this whole conversation continues to be complicated. Some say that Black History Month is not fair, that it is trivial, that it is unnecessary. And of course, there's always that special someone, usually in the back of a class that I'm teaching or online, with less than pure motives, who will ask me with a little smile, well, when is White History Month? As if they've caught me in some sort of trap. If you're wondering, in North America, White History Month, while not officially recognized, falls under January, February, March, April. You get the point. The discourse is exhausting because you can get really caught up in a blizzard of legitimate concerns, but also white supremacist talking points. And they're all kind of speaking together in a blender at the same time. And as a historian, I kind of get smack dab in the middle of it every time, with people sending me various think pieces that I'm meant to comment on. And I'm not going to give you a definitive answer to any of that discourse today, because it's worth being a conversation. But I do promise that I'll reflect on it at the end. Unfortunately, many people are very simply ignorant about Black History Month. The fact of the matter is that many of the people who are engaged in that discourse that I'm constantly subjected to tend not to know where Black History Month actually comes from and why we celebrate it in the first place, let alone why it is in February. And as far as I'm concerned, they can be forgiven for that, because even though we have a whole month dedicated to the history and commemoration, as a society, we don't always do a good job of explaining why. When I thought about doing this, I realized where this month comes from and why we celebrate is probably the most important history lesson that I could give anybody this year. I won't solve the debate this way, but maybe I can inform it a little bit better. Many people have spoken both for and against Black History Month, and regardless of their reason, they seem to think that Black History Month is something relatively new. Some people see it rather cynically as a ploy by political parties to score diversity points while doing very little work. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that power structures do not use the month in this way. They do, but this celebration of Black achievement is not new, nor was it a toothless diversity ploy. Black History Month, or at least the idea of Black History Month, is old. It is Black and it is very political. This concept of celebrating Black history and Black accomplishments is almost 100 years old now. And what lays the foundation for the celebrations is crucial, not just for Black people, but for everyone. So let me tell you a story about a Black man by the name of Godwin Woodson. Woodson never wrote an autobiography, unfortunately, even though he wrote a lot during his lifetime. So I'm going to take a good chunk of this story about his early life from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or ASALH. That was the organization that he started, because they've compiled a lot of his early life together from the bits and pieces we have. So Woodson was born in New Canton, Virginia in 1875, and that's how far we have to go back for this. Woodson's parents, James Henry Woodson and Anne Eliza Riddle, were former enslaved people. James Woodson was a Civil War veteran who had learned carpentry from his father and laid the foundations for homes to earn his income. And the Woodsons were, in a sense, quite lucky because they did own land in the South, roughly 6 acres, which is not a lot, but after the Civil War, former enslaved people owning any land in the South was actually quite impressive. The Woodsons were quite poor, however, which was exacerbated by the fact that Carter Woodson was actually one of 9 children. According to the legend says that he was his mother's favorite. Like many more former enslaved people, James Woodson, so that would be Carter Woodson's father, was illiterate. Carter described him as intelligent and proud. In the late 19th century, it was actually common as a practice for Black families to send their children to work for white people, usually on their farms, to help supplement the family's income. James would not do this, and instead, Carter would work on the family farm. This dignity may have been part of the reason that Carter was often hungry. And while we're having this conversation about commemoration, ASALH has an interesting story about his mother, Anne. Apparently, Carter Woodson recalled that she hated George Washington, the first president of the United States. And the reason for this is that she remembered seeing his statue while being auctioned in Richmond, Virginia. She saw his hand pointing south and saw that as an endorsement of slavery. Carter would go on to be a little more charitable to Washington in his histories. But I just thought that that was important to note that Black people have always questioned and disrupted the narratives of white supremacy. And Carter Woodson was influenced by this at an early age. Disrupting common narratives is partially what Black History Month is all about, and he was getting that from his mother at a very early age. In terms of formative events, Carter Woodson talked about reading a moral and religious story. So this was a book that he had gotten a hold of, and basically the story, it's kind of one of those typical moral tales that they used to have in like the late 19th and into the early 20th century, where there would be a moral tale of one boy who did everything right and another boy who didn't do everything right, and the things that happened to them. So the boy who did everything right, he went to school, he studied, he went to college, he was a success. The other boy who didn't do those things, he was not a success. And apparently this actually did have an effect on him. And Woodson said that he wanted to be the successful boy and he wanted to go to college. And by all accounts, he seems to have been a very good student. But the problem is, and this was true for a lot of Black people all over North America, not just in the South, he wasn't able to attend school on a regular basis because he was often needed on the farm. In the 1880s, the Woodsons moved to Fayette County, West Virginia, where Carter found work as a coal miner. And according to ASALH, this was the place where he met Oliver Jones. And Jones was a Black Civil War veteran who owned a tea house for Black coal miners. And Jones was like his father, who was illiterate but very intelligent. And Jones collected all kinds of print, from books to newspapers to magazines, and he was trying to learn to read by having people read to him. And Woodson would start reading to him, which had the effect of also teaching Woodson about the different people, places, and things that Jones had collected print on. And Woodson read to Jones just as he had done and continued to do for his father. In 1895, Woodson entered Frederick Douglass High School, which was an all-Black school, at the age of 20. He was absent a lot because he was working, but he often studied on his own, and he completed a 2-year program in about a year. And Woodson would also teach at the high school for a period, along with Sunday school. Woodson is one of those kind of 19th century Black folks that I always look at, and I wonder if they ever actually slept, because he did so much. So eventually, Woodson would graduate from Berea College in Kentucky in 1903, just 1 year before Kentucky passed the Day Law, which prohibited interracial education. So he got just in under the radar there. Woodson believed in the power of education, and he wanted to travel, and he would. Spain had ceded the Philippines to the United States in 1898, and Woodson took on a teaching post there from 1903 to 1907, and that was part of the United States' efforts to establish a school system there as part of their colonization efforts. He would have been one of about 600 teachers, and this was a really formative experience for Woodson, and one of the many building blocks to how we are all here. Woodson saw the books that Filipino children were being given, and he knew what they were being taught. Most of the Filipino children, their lessons had very little to do with their lived experience. The curriculum was written by white Americans as a colonizing measure, and as a result, the curriculum was about teaching Filipinos English, and about white American heroes and white American songs. White supremacy was embedded into the curriculum, and it erased Filipinos from their own country, suggesting that they, as a people with no history and accomplishments, were incapable of governing themselves. They needed white Americans to do this for them. Woodson understood that something similar was being done in America to Black people. The education was a way of controlling populations. Now, I don't want to say that the Philippines made him understand this, though, because as like some sort of revelation. He was a Black man trying to educate himself in the South. But going to the Philippines and seeing this work and seeing the system from the ground up really helped to kind of mold his ideas about education. And if you're wondering about the picture I have here, this is a political cartoon that was done in 1901. And basically what it's trying to depict is the woman with the woman with the books there. That's Uncle Sam. He is representing America. The people on the other side are meant to be Filipino people. He's offering this woman, who is meant to represent American education, basically white education. The man with the gun is meant to represent the US military. And the caption reads, "It's up to them." So basically, if you do not accept our re-education, our way of life, then our military will basically run you over, is basically what it's saying. So these are just the different ways that they're controlling the population. Traveling and seeing a similar model practiced on another population outside of the US, again, just really helps to develop Woodson's philosophy on the importance of history and education in general. So after returning to America, Woodson went further, and he enrolled and he received his bachelor's and a master's degree in European history from the University of Chicago. However, he was still not done. And he went even further. He attended Harvard. In 1912, Woodson earned his PhD. His dissertation was on the creation of the state of West Virginia after the Civil War. This made Woodson the second African American to earn a PhD in history from Harvard, the first being W.E.B. Du Bois. And since it's Black History Month, and we sometimes like to talk about firsts, it is worth noting that, well, Carter Woodson was not the first African American to get a PhD. He was the first African American who was born from enslaved people because Du Bois's parents were born free people. After receiving his PhD, Woodson found for a long time that universities were unwilling to hire him, and as a result, he continued to teach at public schools, and he eventually did start working in academia from about 1919 to about 1922. First at Howard University and then at West Virginia College. These are both Black universities. We would call them HBCUs now. Um, However, while these were Black colleges, it is worth noting that at the time, many of their administrators and faculties were not Black, and Woodson often clashed with them about things like the curriculum. Eventually, Woodson would determine that he did not want to work within universities despite his qualifications. Carter Woodson understood that the history of Black Americans had been ignored in the past and was continuing to be ignored in the present, even at these Black universities. For example, just as another example outside of academia, the American Historical Association was incorporated by Congress in 1889 for, quote, the promotion of historical studies, the collection and preservation of historical manuscripts, and for the kindred purposes in the interests of American history and the history of America, end quote. They claimed that they were an association that was meant to support new historical research, and yet Woodson, who was a dues-paying member and one of the cutting-edge historians of his day, he was not allowed to attend some of their conferences. So he paid money to be a part of that organization, and he wasn't allowed to go to several of their conferences because they were segregated because he was Black. And this was a huge issue for him. So Woodson, in his career as a historian, ran into a dilemma that so many Black people all over North America had to face constantly, and is also a part of Black History Month. It's part of that discourse that we keep having. From the beginning, Black people in North America often rejected any kind of segregation, constantly trying to fight for their right to be treated as equal and integrate into institutions. And this is especially true on the issue of education. Black people often expressed that they were Americans, or in our case, Canadians, and they wanted to be treated as such. However, what were Black people in North America supposed to do while the fight for integration was happening? How long did they have to sit in a segregated church pew at Sunday service? What were their children supposed to do while they fought school boards and administrators for their right to an education? Moreover, as Carter Woodson wondered, was it truly possible for Black people to receive a fulfilling education in facilities with white supremacist curriculums? And so the question was, do Black people start their own institutions and address the needs of the people? This is an old question in Black intellectual circles, nothing new. Carter Woodson was dealing with. In fact, Black Canadians have had a pretty big fight about that over schools in the 19th century, and I wanted to use this as an example. So I chose this as my example of this particular dilemma, not only because it's a Canadian example, but because Marianne Shadd just recently got her own stamp, so it's topical. So I'll try to keep this short so we don't lose track of Woodson. Marianne Shadd Carey came to Canada in the 1850s. She was an activist, newspaper editor, teacher. She's also one of those people that I wonder if she ever slept. Shadd opened a racially integrated school in Windsor in 1851. And why that matters is that in 1850, the Common Schools Act in Canada West, which is in Ontario, allowed for the creation of separate schools for Black people. The practice was done before this, but the legislation made it official. So there was segregation before this. This just makes it legal. Now, Shadd believed in integration, and that's why she opened up that school. And the subject of schools in particular can be found in some of the published articles in her newspaper, The Provincial Freedman. Because Black people had been excluded from many white institutions all over the province, Black people had, in some cases, did their best to try and establish schools to teach their children on their own with varying rates of success. It depends on where you go. Some of the schools are really good, some of them aren't, and that's how it is with these kind of institutions. Shadd and other Black activists argued in the pages of the Freeman, which was again her newspaper, and they also argued this elsewhere, that segregated schools were detrimental to Black people and that Black people were stunting their own equality by allowing segregation to fester in the community, and that they should be fighting to be equal and not settle for second-class citizenship. And Shad had a point. The fact that Black people had set up their own schools did, in fact, work against them in the province in the battle for equality. The fact that some Black schools were established and then attended by Black people was used by white supremacists to argue that Black people preferred segregation and continued the practice. White supremacy threw Black people in Canada into this awful cycle of anti-Black racism. So anti-Black racism caused the need for the Black schools in the first place, but then once the schools were built, their existence was used to justify continued segregation. It's a big circle that people get caught in. And this was a circle that Black people did not want to be in. They did not want to be segregated. Here's the problem, though. Many Black people agreed with Shad, but those Black schools were created separately by Black people and their white allies to address the needs of the Black people. And they were often the only options. What were they supposed to do? Should they wait? How long did they have to wait? What did their children do in the meantime? Moreover, if the white schools were integrated, would they do so begrudgingly? What would Black education look like in a school that they were not wanted in, and that they had to force their way into? Would there be Black teachers, or at least white ones, who looked kindly on their children? What is the best way to address the needs of the Black communities in this predicament? And the thing is that there is no easy answer to this, because these are all legitimate concerns. And Carter Woodson is going through yet another version of this dilemma in the early 20th century. Should he stay in academic institutions? After all, Black history is American history. America would not be America without Black people. But as a historian, should Carter Woodson continue to pester academic institutions and groups like the American Historical Association? Should he continue to give them his money? Should he continue to pester them to listen to him and take Black history and Black people seriously? How long was that going to take? And here's the thing, according to the American Historical Association, this is from their own website, no African Americans were represented on their governing council until 1959. And for context, Carter Woodson died in 1950. So he would have died before he would have seen a Black person on their governing council. And in the meantime, while Carter Woodson would be waiting and pushing, how many Black Americans would go through life thinking that they had no history and hope, and what would that do to them? And what history would be lost and not collected in the meantime of waiting for this to happen? And so Carter Woodson surveyed the situation, and he concluded that as a Black professional historian, his options were limited, and that the best course of action was to establish a separate institution that would facilitate the research, writing, and publishing of works about Black Americans. So in September of 1915, William D. Hargrove, George Cleveland Hall, Alexander L. Jackson, James E. Stamps, and Carter Woodson established the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Just as a side note, regarding the terminology, Negro was one of the more common terms used to refer to Black people in the early 20th century in North America. And I know that's a really strange thing to think about now, but in the early 20th century in North America, there were actually big discussions amongst Black people as to what the correct name should be for people of African descent living in North America. For some people, the discourse, they liked the term Negro. Others preferred colored. And again, there was a debate about it. So in many documents from this early part of the 20th century, you typically see one of those two terms used in Black sources. And these are Black people having these discussions. This isn't white people necessarily imposing this on them. Black and African American or African Canadian as more popular terms, that comes a little bit later. And even then there's a discourse. The organization changed their name to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, shortened to ASALH in 1973. That also reflects the changes, so that's part of history as well. Terminology changes all the time. Woodson described the mission of the association to be the scientific study of the neglected aspects of Negro life and history. And according to historian Darlene Clark, who I got a little bit of the organization portions of this today. The organization got off to a bit of a rocky start when Woodson actually borrowed $400 without asking for the consent of the council. And the reason that he took the $400 was because he wanted to produce the first issue of the Journal of Negro History. This caused at least one of the members to resign over it. And just for context, that's over $10,000 in today's money that he took to start this journal without asking anybody. Woodson's vision for the association, I think, was reflective of his upbringing, which is why I spent a little bit of time on his early life. Woodson was an academic and he spent time in those circles and he cared about history and how it was practiced. But I don't think that he ever forgot the poor farm that he grew up on or those black coal miners that he worked with either. Woodson did not want the association to be made up of a bunch of elite scholars just talking amongst themselves because that's an echo chamber. The danger with that is producing scholarship that nobody can read or will read, and he didn't want that. He was thinking about all Black people rather than just his circle of intellectuals. Woodson wanted a historical association that appealed to the broader Black community. He wanted Black history to be accessible. And so over the first few years, the members worked to build networks for the association. And these networks were made up of Black teachers at the primary and secondary level, church groups, Black fraternal organization, Black women's groups. They developed Black history clubs in their areas. Many of the early meetings had by the association were held at colleges and universities, but they were also held at high school auditoriums. They were held at different community centers, and they were especially held at Black churches. And the Black church was often used for a couple of reasons. First, it was usually the building in the community that could hold the most people, given any community in America. But more importantly, the church in those early years was a central hub of Black life. It was a place where some of the more professional Black people and working class Black people all all kind of came together. Woodson and the members of the association were not just creating a club, they were creating an entire Black history movement by doing this. The association ran conferences and published the Journal of Negro History starting in 1916, which Woodson actually edited until his death. This journal is also still running today. They just changed their name to the Journal of African American History. The first issue contained a piece by Woodson about Black people in Cincinnati, Ohio before the Civil War, where he discussed the long history of Black settlement in the city in the 19th century of free people and Black freedom seekers. There's an article by William Hartgrove that tells the story of Black Virginians Maria Lewis Moore and Fannie M. Richards. Moore's mother he describes as actually a free woman of color from Toronto. There are reviews of books, notably famed women's activist Mary Church Terrell reviewed Carter Woodson's book, The Education of the Negro Before 1861, which was published in 1915. And I want to read a statement found in the opening pages of the journal, and I've cut this into a few bits for time. It is a reflection on on Americans that practically nothing has been done to save and publish the records of the Negro race. This statement points out a few attempts that had been made to document Black life, but Woodson points out that they were meager offerings and they were often hidden away and inaccessible to only the privileged few. Quote, accepting what can be learned from current controversial literature, which either portrays the Negro as persecuted saint or brands him as a leper of society, the people of this age are getting no information to show what the Negro has thought and felt and done. The Negro is therefore in danger of becoming a negligible factor in the thought of the world. In the centuries to come, when scholars, after forgetting the prejudices of this age, will begin to make their researches for the whole truth, they will only have one side of the question if the Negro does not leave something to tell his own story. It goes on to explain that the formation of the association as a group established to raise funds and collect historical and sociological material. It ends by saying that the journal itself is not an end in itself. that through the medium of the journal hoped to publish documents that would push Black history as a movement to discuss Black people and their contributions to society. Quote, our purpose then is not to drift into the discussion of the Negro problem. We shall aim to publish the facts, believing that the facts properly set forth will speak for themselves. And in that first issue, the journal listed 5 ways to help the cause of Black history. 1 was to subscribe to the journal. 2, become a member of the association. 3, contribute to their research funds. 4, and this one's really important, collect and send us the historical materials bearing on the Negroes of your community. 5, urge every Negro to write us all that he knows about his family history. So they're not just writing about this history, they are desperately trying to collect it too. The journal allowed a medium for Black scholars to publish their work, and while Woodson himself was not always the most progressive on women's issues or acknowledging their contributions, it must be noted that the journal itself was an early journal where Black women could publish their work. And while it was a Black journal, largely envisioned for the Black community, white scholars were able to publish in the journal. This offered an important outlet for white scholars who might have had a hard time publishing their work that deviated from the conventional portrayals of Black people. However, there was a bit of a discourse over white scholars in Black history. Woodson encouraged and invited the work of white scholars for certain projects. However, he felt that some of the crucial work on Black history and life in America needed to be done by Black people. The journal and his vision for the association were of a Black organization documenting and teaching about Black people. So the purpose of the association and all of its endeavors was to document the history of Black people. Even now, the association's current mission is to promote, research, preserve, interpret, and disseminate information about Black life, history, and culture to the global community. The scholars for the association and their contributors began looking at census data, slave testimony, family history, and oral history. And they're doing this before a lot of this is even conventional. And this is kind of old hat for historians now, but they're doing this way before a lot of historians are doing this in academic institutions. They moved away from portraying Black people as only victims with little to contribute and moved towards showing them as major contributors to American history. It's interesting for me in particular to reflect on the association of Black historians in the early 20th century, because when I was first being taught about the history of slavery in North America, I wasn't taught about these Black people and their research. The historiography that I read about in papers always started with white authors and credited them for innovating the field. But when I did research for this years later, I found here they were, these early Black historians, and they were some of the first to look at topics like the history of slavery from the enslaved person's point of view. They were doing this in the middle of the Jim Crow period. And for those who don't know, the Jim Crow period refers to the decades of intense racial segregation and Black subjugation after the Civil War. So this era starts in the late 19th century, and it's generally understood to have run until 1965. And they're doing this in the middle of this intense segregation and violence against Black people. In addition to exploitation, segregation, and extreme racial violence, the Jim Crow era was also a time when the dominant white culture did not think of Black people as contributors to society outside of their role as cheap labor, let alone people with a rich history and culture. This was a period where historians argued that Black people had no history. In the early 20th century, one of the leading historians and celebrated historians on slavery and the South had even made the argument that slavery was a positive good for society. And, he was propped up all over the place. Historians in white institutions often either ignored Black people or worse, argued that they were incapable of self-government. The association and Black historians stood in defiant opposition to this and offered some of the most groundbreaking work needed to fight these ideas. History for these Black folks was not just about documenting the past. It was an overtly political act. This is a part of the Black freedom movement, this history movement. Black history was and still and has always been a part of our struggle for freedom and equality. Woodson and the Black historians who joined him at all levels, from the church leaders to professional historians, saw a need and they tried to fill it. And Woodson's work did extend outside of the association. This that I have up here, this is just a selection of his published work. And he also, while doing several of these books, he also wrote for and edited the journal. And this all finally brings me to why we are talking about Woodson in the first place. And I promise I have a point. Frankly, we could talk about Woodson and his accomplishments for quite some time. According to librarian Dorothy Porter Wellesley, who was a friend of his, he would often decline her dinner invitation, saying that she was trying to marry him off and that he was married to his work. And then he would scuttle off to the post office to mail his next article for something. Woodson has a postage stamp. He has several schools, parks, and libraries named after him. There's even a statue of him in Washington, D.C. that reads, "The Father of Black History." And I wanted to talk about Woodson and the Association for the Study of American Negro Life and History for a reason. And that reason is quite simple. Woodson and the Association are the reason that we have Black History Month in the first place. I don't know that he ever wanted accolades that he got or the ones that I'm giving him, but it is interesting to think that in a month dedicated to history and commemoration, I don't see his name brought up too much. And this history is usually not part of the discourse I get subjected to every year. I spent time on Woodson's early life and accomplishments along with the early aims of the associations for a couple of reasons. And the first is that celebrating Black life and accomplishments is part of what Black History Month is all about. The second is that no matter what any side says here in the discourse over Black History Month, I think it's important that you all know that this month was conceived by a Black historian and a Black organization that worked with Black communities to archive the Black experience and make sure that there would be many more Black historians in the future. Woodson spent his life devoted to historical research and collecting artifacts and writing and promoting the history and contributions of Black Americans. And in 1926, Woodson and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History started what was called Negro History Week. 1926 was the official date. Woodson put out the press release. There were a few kind of earlier iterations before that, but 1926 is usually the date that we use for it. So now we finally come to the title of this lecture, why I meant that I actually meant to have, which is why February and what I started this with. So why is Black History Month in February? February was selected actually for some pretty significant reasons to Black people, and it was not selected because it is the coldest month or the shortest month. Negro History Week took place in the second week of February because it was important to Black people in North America. A week ago, which is when the celebration would have occurred, happens to be two pretty important birthdays. On the 12th of February, President Abraham Lincoln was born. And while Abraham Lincoln was certainly not a perfect president when it came to Black issues, Black people often celebrated his birthday starting in 1865 after his assassination. This is because regardless of how critical they were of Lincoln, he was the president who pushed through the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, which mostly abolished slavery in the United States. I apologize for my slideshow, slid one of the pictures over. The second birthday was just as important as any president, and I would argue was probably more important than the president. Frederick Douglass was born enslaved in Maryland, and when he was a young man, he ran north for his freedom. He would go on to be one of the most important activists of the 19th century, and in my opinion, one of the best speakers and writers. Arguably, he was one of the most famous Black men in the world during his time. He was considered to be an important leader in the Black struggle for freedom. Most Black people in America at the time of Woodson establishing this would have known who Frederick Douglass was. Because Douglas was born enslaved, he didn't actually know when his birthday was. Douglas estimated that it was sometime in February, and as a free man, he felt that he should have a birthday, and he started celebrating it on Valentine's Day, February 14th. Douglas died in 1895, and Black Americans started celebrating his birthday pretty soon after. There are early mentions of what was called Douglas Days at Black schools and institutions across the United States starting in the 1890s. Negro History Week was in February because February was already a Black time of celebration. It had a deep history already. Woodson and the association, however, were interested in transforming these celebrations into something that could be even more impactful for Black people. Woodson wanted Black Americans to move past the celebrations of just these two men because history is more than a selection of people. He was worried that Black Americans were putting these people on too high of a pedestal. Negro History Week would be about Black people and their accomplishments, not this great man or that one, because history is made by the people. Woodson and the association wanted to transform this time of celebration into something even more meaningful. So, when Negro History Week was launched in 1926, Woodson argued that the teaching of history was absolutely essential to the survival of Black people. Quote, if a race has no history, if it has no worthwhile tradition, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world and stands in danger of being exterminated. Woodson also drew parallels to the systematic racism and oppression of the Jim Crow era he was living in. A Negro is passed on in the street and is shoved in the mud. He complains or strikes back and is lynched as a desperado who attacked a gentleman. And what if he is handicapped, segregated, or lynched? According to our education and practice, if you kill one of the group, the world goes on just as well or better. For the Negro is nothing, never has been anything, and never will be anything but a menace to civilization. Immediately, there was an interest in Negro History Week. This in part stems from years of that relationship that the association had cultivated with Black organizations all over the country. Negro History Week started popping up all over the place very quickly. In the 1920s, there was a hunger for Black history. Teachers wanted materials. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, they produced books, bibliographies, pamphlets, and other promotional literature like this to help with the celebration, to the point where they actually had a hard time keeping up. While Woodson was alive, these celebrations reached every state, and sovereign foreign countries also started celebrating, and this included some communities in Canada as well. Woodson knew that systematic racism was a tradition that it was taught by schools. By not including the accomplishments of African Americans to the history of the country, Black students were being taught that they were inferior, that no one of their race had ever accomplished anything to the history of the country or ever would. Black children would learn about white inventors, founders, artists, and philosophers, but never any Black ones. Woodson saw that this sent them into a cycle of defeat that would continue on into adulthood, arguing. The thought of inferiority of the Negro is drilled into him in almost every class he enters and in almost every book he studies. Woodson believed that one of the ways to liberate Black Americans was through the mind and through education. By highlighting the accomplishments of Black Americans, Black people would see themselves as a part of history, as important and culturally significant to the world, as inventors, artists, poets, and scholars. So I think it's important to highlight in a bit more detail what Black people actually did during Negro History Week. And I'm taking a good chunk of this from some interviews that were provided in Jarvis and Gibbons' excellent article on early school celebrations in this period. So most of my quotes are going to be from schools rather than churches, who also celebrated the week. The Black press promoted the week, and teachers were critical to the success of Negro History Week. And Negro History Week was a celebration that was built on tradition. It was not a week where students were given a bunch of facts to memorize. People who experienced early celebrations in the first 30 years or so as children described an emotional experience that connected them to the past. Activist Angela Davis grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, where Negro History Week celebrations were had. And according to Givens, she stated in a 2011 interview that when she was a child, she saw a picture of Harriet Tubman during the celebrations. And she thought that Harriet Tubman looked an awful lot like her grandmother. Actor and activist Ozzie Davis grew up in Georgia, and he remembered learning about people like the enslaved insurrectionist Nat Turner and the ways in which he and his classmates connected with the history. Quote, we glorified these heroes. Sometimes we would create amongst ourselves our own versions of what Nat did and what we would have done if we had been old Nat, and how that would have satisfied us greatly. Students would put on plays and skits, recite Black poetry, and sing songs. Quote, the teachers spent time after school training us. One child would have to know Frederick Douglass's orations, another would have to learn the poems of Phillis Wheatley, and various other aspects of Black history would be emphasized. And then when the day came, the community would be invited to come to the school and sit in the auditorium where we children would go up on stage one by one and recite what it was that we had learned with a great deal of pride. And I remember with a little fear and trepidation too, because the teachers who had taught you would be standing in the wings, and I remember when I was doing the comb pots hot, I ran blank and I turned and I saw my teacher, I think I came up with two original stanzas before I could get on track, which didn't I don't think the audience ever knew that I had gone off. The teacher knew, but that was such a wonderful experience. And just for context, the Corn Ponds Hot is a Paul Laurence Dunbar poem. It's written in a Southern Black dialect. These events were not just restricted to the school. The things that the students learned in their performances were shared with the community, just as that quote basically says. It wasn't just a performance for the school. The entire Black community was asked to come in and watch the children do their performances. They acted out scenes of resistance. They recited poetry. Their parents brought in sweets. In some cases, students interviewed people who were formerly enslaved. One program invited African international students from Hampton University to talk about life in Africa. There were parades, lectures, breakfasts, expositions. The school was a hotbed of activities. But the churches and the other organizations held celebrations as well. To facilitate the celebrations and the growth of Black history, the association sent out pamphlets and other resources as well. In 1937, the association started issuing the Negro History Bulletin at the behest of teacher and activist Mary McLeod Bethune. The purpose of the bulletin was to provide teachers with information about Black history. It was there to encourage and help with the Negro History Week programs, but the bulletin was also interested in providing resources for Black history all year round. One of the very first bulletins in 1837 contains stories. That's what I have a picture of for you there. It contains stories about the Underground Railroad. On the front page was Ellen and William Craft, who were an enslaved couple who had escaped slavery by steamboat. Ellen had actually disguised herself as a wealthy white planter, hence why she has the top hat in the picture. And William posed as her enslaved servant, and they made it to Philadelphia on Christmas. The pages have profiles of the father of the Underground Railroad, William Still, and white abolitionists, John Brown and Levi Coffin. The next issue profiled Black authors like Zora Neale Hurston and Claude McKay discussing Black poetry. That issue came out in December, and it asks readers to, quote, start preparation now for your Negro History Week programs, for you should help to destroy the idea that the public mind has of disposing of the Negro in the curriculum during 7 days. In 1939, there's an issue that has sections about the issues of teaching Black history in elementary and secondary schools. So there's a discourse that is actually happening in these bulletins where you have Black teachers who are talking to each other about how best to teach Black students. The secondary school article takes time to point out that for older children, Black history should not just be about teaching them basic facts about important figures, but they should be learning about people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth in relation to the times in which they lived, that they were an important part of. It also talks about the importance of engaging students and making history interesting and relevant to them. So again, this isn't just a bulletin where they give you a bunch of facts of like who the first person was to do this or that. This is a bulletin where Black teachers are having a discourse about how to properly teach students in their time. These are conversations being had by Black people from the very beginning. A 1934 issue of the Journal of Negro History contained an outline by A.D. Wright for teachers, not just for the week, but in general. It said that teachers must teach Black children as much as we can about the background from which he has come, the circumstances of his coming to this country, slavery and emancipation, the story of accomplishments of men and women of his race who have risen above handicaps, difficulties, discrimination, prejudice, and even active opposition to accomplish great things as men and women and as citizens of these United States and other countries. The celebration of Negro History Week and the teaching of Black history were meant to propel Black students forward. Teaching Black people about other Black people like Frederick Douglass was a way for them to demystify them. To a young Black student, the greatness of somebody like Frederick Douglass might have seemed out of reach, that this person is almost godlike in their accomplishments. Um, and they would put them on such a pedestal. And it's hard for a student to see themselves in a person that society deems so great. But for a student to read his story or recite his defiant Fourth of July speech made Douglass just a little bit more human to them. And it made them understand that Douglass was a Black American and so were they. And that their teachers often made it clear to them that it was their job to carry on the legacy of people like Douglass as they move forward. These celebrations did talk about what many of us are now familiar with, the first Black man to do this, the first Black woman to do that. But it was always assumed that if there could be a first, then there would be a second, and there would be a third, and so on. This is a quick section before we wrap up with the discourse that I started us off with. So Negro History Week started being celebrated as Black History Month in the 70s. Black educators and students at Kent State are often credited with starting to celebrate the whole month, and this was picked up all over the country within a few years. So Gerald Ford, who I have a picture of in the middle, he's in the middle of that photo there. He was the first president to recognize the celebration in 1976 when America was celebrating its bicentennial. Quote, the last quarter century, this is from Gerald Ford's speech on the matter, quote, the last quarter century has finally witnessed significant strides in the full integration of Black people into every area of national life. He's referring to the civil rights movement here. In celebrating Black History Month, we can take satisfaction from this recent progress in the realization of the ideals envisioned by the founding fathers. But even more than this, we can seize the opportunities to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. I urge my fellow citizens to join me in tribute to Black History Month and the message of courage and perseverance it brings to us all. And since then, it has been recognized and celebrated all over the world in many forms, not just in Black institution. So Canada officially recognizes Black History Month in 1995. That was following a motion introduced by the Honorable Jean Augustine in 1995. That's the official date of recognition, but Black folks had been celebrating Black History Month and Negro History Week in Canada before that. Just kind of as an example, in Ontario, the Ontario Black Historical Society, they sent a petition for Toronto to formally proclaim February as Black History Month in 1978. And that's a relatively recent revelation. They were celebrating it in their own communities before that. And that's a very brief history of Black History Month. how it came to be, why it's in February, and the various ways it was celebrated. But ultimately, we still have to deal with that discourse that I started with. And I'm not going to solve any problems today, but I will engage with some of the discourse. Currently, there are complaints that Black History Month feels cheap. Institutions and organizations use it to superficially check off a diversity box without actually engaging with Black issues. That is a critique that I completely understand. There are very few things, unfortunately, in this world that avoid commercialization, and very few movements that avoid that hollow lip service at opportune moments from people in power. I am a board member for a Black Historical Society, and the requests that we get in the middle of February can be a little bit depressing. We forgot it was February. Can you do something for us tomorrow? Can you give us 10 minutes during our lunch break? Oh, you can just talk about anything. It doesn't matter. Sometimes, unfortunately, if we as a Black organization don't have time, they will gather unqualified people or just do it themselves, or they will do nothing. And would you believe that Woodson was in fact angry about that exact issue in the 1930s? By the 1930s, Negro History Week was popular. And again, this is the problem. Even the things with the most purest intentions, when they become popular, commercialization and exploitation always follow. The current Association for the Study of African American Life and History points out that Woodson often complained during his time about, quote, intellectual charlatans appearing in order to take advantage of the public's interest in Black history. So they were seizing the opportunity, people who are unqualified. He warned teachers not to invite speakers who had less knowledge than the students themselves. Increasingly, publishing houses that had previously ignored Black topics and authors rushed to put out books on the market and in schools. Instant experts appeared everywhere. Non-scholarly works appeared from mushroom presses. Unfortunately, these problems have not been completely solved. However, rather than condemning the month itself for its cheapness, perhaps demanding quality and authenticity is what matters than cynically pointing to the month as the sole arbiter of the problem. So this is something that has been an issue from the beginning, and we just kind of need to be more vigilant about it. Some of the loudest voices on the discourse, and I'm rather sympathetic to some of them, discuss the various ways in which Black History Month is too confining. It is segregating the history to a cold, dark month when reform in our education system is needed. Some people say you're going to confine the history to the month and question this. And that's a question that I wrestle with because it takes me back to that persistent Black dilemma that Woodson, Marianne Shadd, and so many Black people has faced throughout our history in North America. Black history is embedded into the history of this continent. But I sit and wonder, it has been almost 100 years since Woodson. Isn't it time to do away with this month and take our place in history integrated with other stories that we tell? Even Woodson had hoped that the need for the week would end. Not the study or the celebration, but the designated time. But I'm stuck because I don't know if we're there yet. And I wonder what will happen to Black students and communities while we wait to be included better. And even then, will we be included the right way? Or as Woodson argued, is it advisable to wait for that infinite time when writers of textbooks will become broad enough to mention the Negro humanely? We have already waited for 3 centuries. And that was 3 centuries at this point, and now it's almost 4. I have to be honest with myself too. Most of the people I encounter tell me that the only time that they ever learn about Black history was in February, and they usually tell me that they learned about it as children. Our stories are children's stories that we tell to people. And that's rather sad, but at the same time, I wonder how much worse things would be if we take it away as well. Would that allow for better inclusion if we took it away? Or would that make the chasm even deeper? And I don't know what the answer is. And I suspect most of the passionate people having these discussions don't actually know either, even if they say that they do. I do, however, want to suggest something here to think on. If the month ever feels like the ghettoization of Black history, perhaps it's because we are doing it wrong. To begin, Carter Woodson was very clear in his early intentions for Negro History Week. Quote, "It is not so much a Negro History Week as it is in Negro History Week. We should emphasize not the Negro history and not Negro history, but the Negro in history." Woodson never believed that Black history could be crammed into such a small time frame. The week was filling a need because something needed to be done, but more importantly, it was never supposed to just be a week from its very inception. The December 1938 Negro History Bulletin states, "Do not forget Negro History Week. Do not wait until the end of January to prepare your program. Work out your exercises as a demonstration of what you have been doing in your schools and clubs throughout the year. Do not ask persons on the outside to bring you a program. Carry a program to them." I think February 1938, as an issue of the Negro History Bulletin, gives us the most important history lesson for Black History Month. Carter Woodson wrote the following under the headline, "Starting Right." Some teachers and their students have misunderstood the celebration of Negro History Week. They work up enthusiasm during the few days, stage a popular play, present an orator of the day, or render exercises of literary order, but they forget the Negro thereafter throughout the year. To proceed in such a fashion may do as much harm as good. It is a reflection on the record of the race to leave the impression that its history can be thus disposed of in a few days. Negro History Week should be a demonstration of what has been done in the study of the Negro during the year, and at the same time, a demonstration on the greater things to be accomplished. The same article talks about making Negro History Week count. It tells readers to ask their libraries for more books on Black people. It states that Black people needed a bigger personal libraries. Woodson tells readers to establish programs to raise money for books. He tells them that pictures of great Black people should hang in the classrooms of Black schools along with the white ones. He argued that the week was the occasion to emphasize the saving of records, diaries, bills of sale, and wills to send them to the association so they could be preserved. Negro History Week was a time to emphasize local history as well. The week was never meant to start in the second week of February and end there. It was a call to action. Negro History Week was the culmination and celebration of all of the work that had been done throughout the year. And no matter where you fall in the discourse, perhaps we should all remember that this month. That's me. So I guess we'll open it up for questions and I'll stop
Yeah,
sharing my slides.
perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We did have a comment during your presentation
Mm-hmm,
when you were talking about the person reciting their own verses. So
mm-hmm.
Karen Upshaw said, "It's amazing that he could just come up with a couple of verses while he tried to remember the original words." Yeah.
Yeah, well, he did go on to become a pretty good actor, so maybe that was a sign at the time because that was a quote from Ozzie Davis. So he did go on to be an actor, so maybe that was a sign that he was going to be able to do that.
He obviously had the skills. Is there anybody else that has any questions?
I had another comment, and I guess, Deirdre, I'd be interested to know what you think. I understand all of what you were saying about, do we leave the month of February as is? Is it causing harm? Is there a better way to do this? I think so many people are at a different place in their understanding, and especially in the last few years, that it's probably good to keep it going, but then start pushing more strongly about the expectation that if we are teaching something in February, then it should go into the textbook and become a part of the regular curriculum. If there is something that we learn, we should be assigning research projects, I guess, not just in February, but throughout the whole year. And so use it as a leverage point, a leaping off point, I guess. Because there are some people who still will only be able to relate to it as a smaller entity. February is when we look at these things, but there's lots of people, I think, who would want to take it much further.
Yeah, and that is what the point, and this is kind of why I wanted to highlight this, that is what the point of the original Negro History Week was supposed to be. It was supposed to be a starting point for those conversations. And basically what Negro History Week was supposed to be for Black people, and then later Black History Month is supposed to be for Black people. It was supposed to be, that was the time that everybody kind of was supposed to get together and celebrate what they had been doing the whole year. So you're
Huh.
supposed to learn what you've been doing like you're supposed to be learning about Black people the whole year. That was the idea. The week was just about celebrating it. It was about, all right, this is a designated time when we put things together. This is a designated time as a call to action for like people to gather records, for people to do those things. And that was originally what it was supposed to be. That's kind of, I think, the problem when we're having that discourse about Black History Month is we're not talking about, we're not doing it right. The way that a lot of schools do it is they teach very, very bad Black history in February. And then once February is over, then it's done. And that's not what you're supposed to do. And you're supposed to do exactly what you're talking about is you're supposed to be doing stuff the whole year. You're supposed to be shifting the things that perhaps you highlighted a little bit in Black History Month. You're supposed to be doing that. That's kind of the point.
I like that idea. And I wonder if it would help make it more successful, if it could be a time for reporting back.
Yeah.
As opposed to a time for learning.
Yeah.
Let's look back and see how much we've accomplished. I think that's a really great way to look at it.
Yeah.
We're over time now, so I'm going to shut up. But I could keep going forever.
Thanks,
I can
Karen.
stay if there's other questions. It's not a problem.
Is there anybody else that has any questions? I had a question. I was just wondering, on February 8th, it was announced that there'll be mandatory like Black history. I think it's for grade 7s, 8s, and 10s. And I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
I'm always like I'm happy about aspects of it, but I need to, it's one of those kind of situations where I need to kind of assess once I see what their curriculum is actually going to be, because it's you get concerned like when they want to do things like that. I think that that's good, moving in a good direction, but at the same time, this is always the problem. Like, it's good that we're moving in a direction, but there's going to be growing pains. And the question I have is, okay, so they're going to move this into the curriculum. Are they going to do it right? Because some of the Black histories that, like, because I teach Black history at a university level, some of the Black histories that my students get taught is really, really, really bad. The things that they get taught. So I'm happy about it. I'm happy they're moving in that direction, but I I need to see how they're going to do it and how it's going to be implemented as well. And our teachers, like, this is always the problem too. And I'm sympathetic to teachers. Like, are they going to be taught to teach this material properly? Because that's a thing that sometimes we do to, especially teachers in the system, is we throw these curriculums at them and then we don't tell them how to do this. And then what ends up happening is the teacher fumbles and tries to do it, unfortunately poorly, or the burden gets put on like some poor Black person in the community now has to come in and do it. Like, this is always the thing I'm concerned about. These ideas are good, but I always worry because whenever there are these kind of things, it's like, we're going to implement these things, but are we going to do the work that needs to be done? Because I find that a lot of governments and institutions, the problem is they want change, and they are somewhat committed to some of the things that they say. I don't detect insincerity there, but the problem is I find that a lot of institutions, they like big flashy changes. They like, we're going to put this in the curriculum, or we're going to pass this one law. What they don't like is the years of incremental work that it takes to actually make those things a success. They just want to, like, are they just going to throw a curriculum at people and tell them, here, teach this? And there have been Black people, I'd be curious to know who has been consulted, because there have been Black people all over Ontario who have been trying to get curriculums into the schools for many years with varying rates of success. So I'm I'm optimistic, but I'm a historian, so we're forever jaded about things. So I'm cautiously optimistic about it.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. So we had a couple comments. Ellen Miller said, not a question, but thanks for speaking today. And then Melissa Tralla said, thank you very much. Is there anybody else that has any other questions? I think we're okay. It's obviously you've done extensive research because it was a very thorough presentation. I feel like you did cover kind of all of the questions that I had,
Okay.
because I did write notes and then it would get answered. So
Oh, okay. Well, that's
so
good.
yeah, so it was a lovely presentation. So on behalf of myself, the Simcoe County Museum, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I had a great time learning about Black History Month and Carter Godwin Woodson. Sorry.
Yep.
um, I honestly did not know who that was. I did know who Frederick Douglass was, as you said, that's a big name, but I did
Yep.
not know about Carter Godwin Woodson. So I'm glad that I was able to learn about him because, as you said, he was somebody that was very active. I don't know. Did you know, like, did he have children? Because I'm like, I don't know how he would get all
No,
this done. Okay,
no,
yeah,
he
yeah,
never married. Nope, he
yeah.
never married, and he never had any children. He honestly, he constantly said that he was married to his work as a historian.
Yeah. Well, based off
Yeah.
of all the stuff he did, that makes
Yeah.
sense because I was like, honestly, he would not have been able to do all of that.
Yep.
I don't even know how he did what he did, and
I
I'm
don't
sure
know
you.
either.
Yeah, and I'm sure you just like as you said, you just listed off some of it, right? So there's just
Yeah.
even more there.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you for a lovely presentation. We really
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Bye.
Bye. So for everybody that joined us, thank you for joining us today, and please feel free to join us next week. We have our last presentation on Tuesday. Thank you and have a lovely day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.